so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hopes in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect, as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you are called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. This is the word of the Lord.
Good evening. Is that on? Yeah? Good. Good. Right, tonight we are going back to looking at one of the letters written by Jesus' disciple Peter. And it is a letter that is written to little Christian communities that were scattered across an area that we now know as Turkey. And these early followers of Jesus would have been facing lots and lots of challenges. They'd have been facing accusations and slander, just in their ordinary, run-of-the-mill, day-to-day lives. And this is just because of the way that they lived, because they chose to live differently, because they had chosen Jesus. And it was looking very likely that they were going to be facing some really significant suffering. And so in chapter 3 of this first letter of Peter, we see Peter addressing very practically how they could live out Jesus-like lives, but in a hostile world. But living like this, says Peter, gives them a bit of a warning. He says, well, it's going to bring questions, and it's going to bring accusations, and it's going to bring suffering. But all of this can be endured because of Christ. Now, I wonder if you've heard of a lady called Helen Roseveare. She was a medical missionary to the Congo from the 1950s through to the 1970s. She worked really, really hard and fruitfully establishing medical training and medical provision. But after Congo's independence from Belgium in the 1960s, a brutal war broke out. She chose to stay in Congo, but she was captured by the very brutal rebel forces, and she suffered greatly at their hands. A lot of her work was destroyed, but she personally suffered greatly. She was beaten badly on many occasions, and she was raped by her captors. But in her reflections on what happened to her then, and then other hardships that she faced, she focused particularly on one word, and this is what she had to say. One word became unbelievably clear, and that word was privilege. God didn't take away pain. God didn't take away cruelty. God didn't take away humiliation. No, it was all there. But now it was altogether different. It was with him. It was for him. It was in him. He was actually offering me the inestimable privilege of sharing in some little way the edge of the fellowship of his suffering. In the weeks of imprisonment that followed, and in the subsequent years of continued service, looking back, one has tried to count the cost. But I find it all swallowed up in privilege. The cost suddenly seems very small and transient in the greatness and permanence of the privilege. And I think this is the heart of 1 Peter. Suffering and hardship is going to happen. But what we understand about suffering is crucial to how we're going to respond. And Peter is so keen to express this to these early followers of Jesus, to these little scattered communities. That's why in chapter 2, he tells these early Christian slaves that if you do what is right and you suffer for it, bear it patiently. This is to your credit before God. And in chapter 3, verse 14, why he says that if you suffer because of your righteous behavior, God's blessing is on you. And then in chapter 4, verses 12 to 19, he says, if you are abused because of the name of the Messiah, you are blessed by God, because the Spirit of glory and of God is resting on you. In the words of Helen Roseveare, it is a privilege to share in the sufferings of Christ, however they come and whatever level they are. So let's take a look at chapter 3 of 1 Peter. And the first thing we notice is that it starts with a word that we need to think about. It starts with the word likewise, or in the same way. So what we really actually need to do is go back to chapter 2 and find out what he has been talking about. Where is Peter's flow of thought? Well, in chapter 2, verse 13 onwards, Peter starts by asking the early Christians to first and foremost fear and revere and submit to God. And then he asks them to honor and respect the worldly institutions around them for the sake of Christ. Why would he say that? Because through a peaceful and a loving and respectful life, the accusations and the sufferings thrown at the feet of Jesus' followers will in the end all be silenced, and ultimately by Jesus' return. And so Pastor Peter, the leader and the pastor at heart, applies this concept in a good pastor's way. He applies this concept of a peaceful, humble life to the lives that they lived. You know, in this time, in this first century period, a lot of early Christians were slaves. So in chapter 2, he talks about how to live as a slave, but in a Christ-like way. And now, in chapter 3, he talks about marriage and relationships. He's giving these early followers of Jesus some down-to-earth, practical advice about how to live like Jesus in a world that was unfair and it was unjust. But let's not forget who Peter was. He was one of Jesus' disciples. He had watched and listened as Jesus had ministered and taught. And in all of that, he'd also seen how Jesus, when faced with unfair accusations, when faced with threats, when faced with slander, and ultimately the most unjust, cruel, and unfair trial and death, he saw how Jesus acted. Jesus never spoke back with unkind words. He did not repay insult for insult. He did not repay evil for evil. And this, says Peter, is the true calling of a follower of Jesus. And so here we are at chapter 3. We've actually find ourselves really mid-flow in this thought and in this discussion where Peter has just spoken into the reality of slavery, and now he's speaking into the reality of life for men and women, particularly marriage. But it's really important here just to take a little pause and spend some time thinking about how men and women were regarded in the first century. Because it's easy, I think, to read over these scriptures sometimes. And, either we just think, does it really apply? It's, not really apply to our modern way of life. But if we don't understand the historical and the Jewish context, we risk losing an enormous depth of the meaning. So women, in the Roman worldview, were not born Roman citizens. They were only Roman citizens through their connection with a male relative. Therefore, women automatically were subject to and very reliant on their male relatives. Either would have been a father or a husband. And marriage was very much a business arrangement whereby a girl would pass from the father to the husband as their subject. Marriage, children, the home, was all that was expected from a woman. Emperor Augustus even introduced a law that basically formalized this prejudice that was already held, that if a woman wasn't married by the time she was 20, she would be subject to marginalization and legal penalties. Now, within the Jewish context, women at this stage were already separated from men in private life, in public, and religious life. Even going out to the shops, going out of the home in both the Roman context and the Jewish context was deemed highly inappropriate for a woman. I read a very good article by Jews for Jesus when I was prepping for this, and it explains how very far removed this concept of women was from the original Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament. And that actually was likely down to the influence of Greek and Roman cultures, so much so that even the rabbis had allowed this to infiltrate them and slowly relegated women to this first century seclusion. Now, I'm going to go on a tangent here, but doesn't this make Jesus' interaction with women so revolutionary? I loved it when I realized all of this, and I look back at what Jesus had done with all the women he had met and how involved women were in his ministry. How incredible that Jesus even spoke to the woman at the well. How wonderful that he invited Martha to sit at his feet when she was dutifully doing the thing that was expected of her, to be in the kitchen prepping for the men. How amazing that he invited her to come and sit with her sister, that she was already there. And how beautiful that he allowed a woman to wash his feet. And do you know who'd watched all of this? Peter. Peter had been there. He'd watched it all in wonder. It does say that, I think, about the woman at the well. The disciples watched in wonder at what Jesus was doing. And he was watching in wonder at this radical attitude of Jesus. Now, back to the passage. Beauty was a huge part of the Roman worldview because it was thought that the appearance of the woman was thought to affect the reputation of her husband. So if she wore lots of gold in her hair, had her hair done really nicely, wore lots of expensive jewelry, lots of lovely clothes, it was thought to reflect favorably on her husband. So therefore, beauty was really important to women. It was a really, really thriving culture within the Roman Empire. N.T. Wright states, when commenting on 1 Peter 3, that only when we've considered the ways in which women were regarded in the ancient world as a secondary form of human being, we realize just how revolutionary Peter's message really was. So Peter speaks to these early followers of Jesus who were women, who find themselves in marriages where they probably didn't really have that much value. And then extraordinarily, Peter calls out the men, and he presents them with a countercultural challenge on their attitudes and recognitions of who their wives were in the eyes of God. So Peter speaks to the Christian wife, and in this instance, he also specifically refers to the wife of the non-believer. And he encourages her to live as is expected of her in that day. But, he says, live with respect and honor to your husband. Because by her behavior, she can bring her husband to see Jesus. Now, that in and of itself would have been remarkable for that day. She, by her behavior, by the way she acts, can influence the male leadership of the household. And actually, for women in that day, as a Christian, so this is a wife who is a Christian, she loves Jesus, but her husband and the household do not. They still honor and worship all the Roman idols or whatever it is. So she is on her own very much in this. And Peter's saying, by your behavior, you could influence your husband. And taking an even more radical step forward, Peter continues to assert her value by saying, and your beauty is not what the patriarchal society around you say it is. It's not about what value it brings your husband. Your beauty is not about what you put on and all the outward appearances. No, your beauty is about you. Your beauty is about who you are. It's about your heart, your attitude, and the way that you choose to conduct your life. Doesn't really sound radical today, but in that day, in that first century culture, they were truly radical words. And Peter is slicing through cultural stereotypes, and he is speaking value, and he is speaking meaning into the lives of every woman that was listening to that letter being read out loud. Wives, you can influence for Jesus' sake, and you are of value because of who you are. Your beauty is in a heart that loves Jesus. And then, says Peter, husbands, think about how you live with your wives. You know, that wasn't really what husbands did, I don't think, then. And Peter's saying, husbands, think about how you live with your wives, because do you know what? She is a fellow heir with you to the gift of life. She is not a secondary citizen in the eyes of God, so think about how you live with her and pray like you understand she's going to inherit the grace of life that is also yours to inherit. To these husbands, to these men, Peter's actually asking a radical strength, a radical boldness. Because this would have been so different to the way that their mates down the road treated their wives. He's asking them to treat their wives with respect and honor. You see, Peter wants to make it absolutely clear to these early followers of Jesus in chapter 2, where they were slaves, in chapter 3, where they are married couples, that they can stand out. They can hold their heads up despite their culture around them dictating otherwise, and despite the inevitable suffering this was going to bring them. Their way of life was supposed to look different. And so we get to verses 8 to 12. And Peter's summarizing everything he said about slaves, wives, and husbands in an attitude that he wants them to foster in their relationships with each other within the Christian communities, but also with those outside the Christian communities. He says, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, tender-hearted and humble. Don't repay evil for evil or slander for slander, but rather say a blessing. This is what you were called to. When we lived in Senegal, my parents on many occasions had to deal with a corrupt police force. You know, they just did regular stop checks on the road where we traveled. They had to. It was their job. It was what they needed to do. It was important that they kept an eye on who was traveling on the roads. However, what happened on most occasions is that you would drive up, pass a quick bribe through the window, and off you'd go. No problems. But my parents' organization, alongside lots of other Christian organizations, did not engage in bribery. So as a child, I have so many memories of sitting in the car for what felt like hours upon hours upon hours. Sometimes it was a couple of hours, but as the police and my dad sat by the roadside chatting away, sometimes even drinking tea. Sometimes the police would take away my parents' documentation. They didn't always, but there was just no way of us leaving. We would have got into a lot of trouble if they just decided to get up and leave. Really, the only way of leaving was when the bribe was paid. However, as you can tell, my dad, he sat with them, he chatted with them. He didn't repay tit for tat. He waited for as long as it took. And sometimes it was all very friendly, and you really got that sense. It was just really good. I think Dad even even on the occasion, managed to share his faith with them. So sometimes it was all very friendly. Sometimes it was very tense, and Mum would get us to pray in the car. But every single time, we left with all our documentation and no bribe paid. And it wasn't just my parents that acted like that. It was all of those Christians from these organizations in Senegal that acted like that. And in the end, the police force across the country realized that if they pulled a car over and there was one of these people in it from one of these organizations, just let them keep going. It wasn't really worth it. We even, at one point, I checked with my mum that I had remembered this properly, we even, at one point, put little signs up in our windscreens that said Mission Évangélique, so that as we drove up to the checkpoints, the police would read it and be like, just on you go, on you go. And I think this is what Peter is talking about. Be sympathetic, like-minded, loving, peaceful, respectful. And in the end, this way of living out life over many years gave these Christian organizations in Senegal a reputation. And this is exactly what Peter wants of the early Christian church, a reputation for the way that they choose to live. But in verse 14, Peter brings a bit of a warning. And he says, if you're going to live like this, people are going to want to know why. And it's inevitably going to bring criticism and persecution. But I think what you hear as well is the pastor. You hear Peter and his big pastoral heart. And he's saying, I know you're scared to live like this. I know it's terrifying to live so very radically different to everybody else around you. But he says, don't fear them. Don't fear their threats. But hold on to and know Jesus as Lord in your hearts. So you always be ready to make a reply to anyone who asks you to explain the hope that is in you. Anyone who asks you, why on earth do you live like this? Anybody who says to you, why aren't you just doing what everybody else is doing? Hold on to and know Jesus as Lord in your hearts so you can always answer those questions. But, says Peter, answer with gentleness and respect. And so Peter draws back in these last few verses, in verses 18 to 25, to the heart of his message, to the crux of what he wants to say, because he wants to reassure his readers why they don't need to fear, why they can have boldness to stand up and be different, why wives can have the confidence to live in a different way, why husbands can have the boldness to treat their wives with respect and honor. Because when we suffer for doing the right thing, for living like Jesus, maybe even simply for being known as a follower of Jesus, it can be endured with hope and with faith. Because we have a Savior who suffered unjustly too. So we have a Savior who knows it. He understands suffering. But in his death and in his resurrection, Jesus the Messiah has fulfilled the hope of Israel by defeating every spiritual power of the world. Every spiritual power of the world across time. He has fulfilled the hope of Israel by defeating every spiritual power of the world, all the powers of evil and darkness that bring about the day-to-day anger, the day-to-day confrontation we feel in our lives, the day-to-day slander, accusations, hatred. All those powers of evil and darkness have been defeated by Jesus. And all the powers of evil and darkness that bring about great destruction and suffering that right now we see in our world all too clearly, Jesus has defeated all powers of evil and darkness. In his suffering, Jesus the righteous, for us the unrighteous, in his death and his resurrection, God raised Jesus to his right hand. And at that moment, every demon, every imprisoned spirit, every fallen angel, all of the spiritual and earthly realms knew that Jesus has the victory. And this is the heart of Peter's confidence in Jesus. No matter what life throws at you, whatever level of suffering comes your way, be sure to know that in your suffering you stand beside Jesus, the conqueror, the victor over every evil that continues to try and fight to influence this world. But Jesus has the victory. So even though we may suffer, nothing can take away your relationship with Jesus. Nothing can change the truth that we stand with Jesus in his victory. And this is what these last few but confusing verses are all about. So what can we take from 1 Peter 3 tonight? Well, in essence, this: hold your heads up. Keep your consciences clear and dare to live differently, trusting that Jesus' victory will be played out to the world to which we bear witness. Maybe there are colleagues at your work who ostracize you for not engaging in the office gossip. Maybe there are family members who shun you because you chose Jesus. Maybe you face taunts and teasing on a daily basis simply because of the choices you make, because you want to live like Jesus. Maybe you know of other Christians around the world who are suffering, really, really suffering. Whatever the suffering may be, and whatever the suffering might become, keep trusting that Jesus' victory will be played out in this world to which we bear witness.
Thank you, Ali. Let's just take a moment and pray together. And Lord, we want to live the life that you call us to. We thank you for the privilege of that call and for the privilege of